Hi, I'm Tony Sang from Myanmar, which is formerly known as Burma. This is my first semester in UGST and my very first video presentation I've made in my life. I want to discuss about the traditional criticism, which is one of the methodologies of biblical interpretation. It was developed by Hermann Gunkel, who is a German scholar. This criticism is one of the most used methods in approaching the biblical text. This is a quotation from Scott McKnight. He said that the background considerations are necessary if the student is to uncover elements in the text that were simply assumed by the first century writer and his audience in order to understand the intention of the author as made known in the text. The method of traditional criticism argues with the transmission of the biblical literature from stage to stage into their final written form. The word tradition has a broad meaning as it includes the ongoing life, customs, and practice of a group or even a community from generation to the generation. But it is used in this criticism in a narrower sense that it usually refers to the verbal tradition. It refers to the words and texts which were transmitted orally from one generation to the next one. Actually, the Gospels were written many years later the ascension of Jesus, but all the narratives and sayings of Jesus which we read in the New Testament today were not recorded down in detail by the disciples at that time when they were following Jesus. And so there was a gap of time between the life, death, resurrection of Jesus and the final written forms of the Gospels. The Gospels were written before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Let's assume it the Gospel of Mark, and in 1980 as for John. So between the time of Jesus and the written documents of the Gospel, the tradition about Jesus was primarily transmitted by oral forms. So this criticism is all about what went on in the period before these Gospels were written. How did these Gospel texts come to be as they are? What oral traditions lie behind the written traditions we have now? How did the early church shape the stories of Jesus and his followers? This also involves a study of the social and cultural environments of the tradition of the New Testament. And this is also a study of what and how they influenced or motivated the writers to preserve these traditions. This traditional criticism focuses on the history and changes behind the scene within the New Testament writing. So it raised so many important facts about recovering the very word of Jesus or the historical Jesus. And moreover, there has been so much debate on the subject of the transmission of the biography of Jesus before they came into the written form. The main reason is that we cannot really deny the importance of the role of orality in the ancient time. There is no doubt that the majority of the population, as high as 90%, and even in the early church, were not literate. And so, the only access the early Christians could have to the stories of Jesus was oral narration in a public setting. We also understand that books or written documents were even so rare and very expensive in ancient times. Nobody really had access to the books, even if they wanted to. What I want to say is that the oral traditions were highly regarded by the community in the ancient world, and it was commonly accepted. That's why Joel Green said that an interest in the oral traditions concerning Jesus is at the core of the enterprise of tradition historical criticism. So the oral tradition is like the bridge between Jesus and the writing of the gospel. Since the traditional criticism is interwoven with the oral transmission, it raised so many questions about the authenticity. So Robert Stein suggests several factors that would speak for the trustworthiness of the tradition. Let's take a look at some of his suggestions. The first is these oral traditions are based on the eyewitnesses. And second, the leadership in Jerusalem would have passed down the traditions accurately and carefully. And even the New Testament regards these traditions so highly. Let me give you an example in verse 1 to 3 of 1 Corinthians. Here we can see Paul saying that, moreover, brethren, I declare unto you the gospel which I preach unto you, which also ye have received, and wherein ye stand. The fourth fact is that the Asian culture also gives a great respect to memory and tradition than our own today. And there are some criteria to be considered when we are going to approach the traditional criticism, because the scholars who engage in this tradition set up all of these criteria. The first one is the criterion of dissimilarity. It identifies the uniqueness of the saying of Jesus by sifting out any material common between Jesus and the early church. Another criterion is the multiple attestations, which evaluates the authenticity on a saying that appears in multiple strands of traditions or in multiple forms like miracles and parables. If a tradition is shown to be in agreement with what is already being authentic, then it goes with the criterion of coherence. For example, when Jesus spoke of God as his Father, this will also mean that he was identifying himself as the Son of God. There are other less commonly used criteria like divergent patterns, which argues that a tradition that is preserved regardless of the difficult situation is more likely to be authentic. And there are some other criteria like Aramaic linguistic, as in the time of Jesus. Aramaic language was a commonly used language. However, the value of these criteria is only found in their aim to put together a method for evaluating the authenticity of a given piece of Jesus' tradition. So now let's take a look at some example of the use of the traditional criticism. In Mark chapter 6, starting from verse 30 to 39, here we see Jesus and his disciples were trying to be left alone, have some privacy, and even get some rest. But the people kept on following Jesus wherever he was going. I will read all the scriptures for the sake of time. So let's take a look at verse 34. And Jesus, when he came out, he saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them, because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. And in verse 39, then he commanded them to make them all sit down in rooms on the green grass. Here we see how Mark was portraying Jesus as a shepherd and the starving people as sheep. Mark was not even one of the disciples, and I doubt that he was even there that day, or maybe he was there unless somebody told me that that little kid with 5 loaves and 2 fishes might be Mark. And let's take a look at John 10:14. Here Jesus is saying, "I'm the good shepherd." So, as John describes it in his gospel, it is no doubt that the saying of Jesus is well preserved by the disciples and the early church, and Mark portraying like one even before John wrote about it. Here, the question is, how could Mark write something like that in his gospel portraying Jesus as a shepherd? We know that John wrote about that long after Mark. We can see that Mark could have been influenced by Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters, and so on. This psalm would have been, without any doubt, very familiar to the Jewish and the Christian community for centuries. This tradition has been adopted by Mark when he tried to picture Jesus as a good shepherd who was moved with compassion and feed 5,000 people. This tradition criticism is a useful method in order to understand the development and the content of the biblical text. It helps us to understand the importance of the gap between the historical Jesus and the written Gospel of Jesus, which we have today. It also helps the modern reader to interpret in the tradition of the New Testament text, since it reminds us that we are so far away from their time and situations. It also teaches the realities that do not make any sense to us, like social issues, religious customs, and beliefs in the text and also behind the text. Most importantly, it reminds us that the Gospels and other New Testament books were not created in a vacuum. They were written in the time of an early church when the stories and traditions about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection were narrated. However, there are problems when we are going to approach this method, because the traditional criticism regards that the early church community influenced the writing of the Gospels and the story of Jesus. It doesn't see the Gospel as purely historical. It regards the New Testament text as narratives whose backgrounds are formed by the oral tradition. And it does not really give much respect to the divine inspiration of the scriptures, because the Bible says that all scripture is given by the inspiration of God. And I believe that the Bible is not a man-made document, but it is spirit-led, man-made divine books. And we have discussed that oral tradition was highly regarded with great accuracy in ancient times. So, why are we gonna doubt the orality? We generally agree that the Synoptic Gospels were written before the destruction of the temple in AD 70. So how could this less than 40 years do any change for the oral forms to written form? This period of time cannot really alter the oral narrative, the oral tradition, or even evolve new form. Another reason is that the Apostle John lived until AD 90, which means he was alive during the writing of the Gospel and even a witness for the writing. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 that there were over 500 people who saw the resurrected Jesus at once, and most of them were still alive. They were all eyewitnesses who carried the oral tradition of Jesus in the early Christian church. And the early church did not just make up something, but they highly valued the apostolic tradition, as Paul wrote in 2 Thessalonians. So, it was not the church that modeled the gospel account, but it was the church that was modeled by the gospel account. Last but not least, it will give rise to a question, that is, why would the apostles and many other Christians of the early church suffer persecutions and even face death for a false tradition of their own making? As a conclusion, I would like to add that traditional criticism tries to reconstruct the historical of the transmission of tradition and historical Jesus. It might be a good method of interpreting the Bible, but one must be very careful when approaching to this criticism, since it can be misleading. Thank you.